If you love scrap and crumb piecing quilts, you are going to be so obsessed with the Crumb Cake Quilt. Hi friends, Tracy here from the Sewing Channel. Welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome. Have you ever been watching a tutorial on YouTube about a certain quilt? As you're watching it, you're like, oh my word, I must make this quilt. And you know what I'm talking about too if you're a quilter. You've got that quilt in your mind and you just can't shake it until you make it. This quilt right here is called the Crumb Cake Quilt. I first saw this technique demonstrated by Cindy Rang from the Fabric Patch. She gives us all kinds of tips and tricks in her tutorial. I will link her tutorial on the Crumb Cake Quilt down below this video. I'm so obsessed, I can't stop looking at it. Enough talking already. Let's get busy obsessing over the Crumb Cake Quilt from the Fabric Patch. All of these fat quarters have been just sitting in my sewing room, just waiting for the perfect pattern to make a quilt. These are so gorgeous. I just did not want to cut into them until I found just the right pattern. All of these prints go in one collection and they're made by Clothworks, and it's called Painted Patchwork. Two of my fat quarters already have the patchwork put together, so I'm not sure how I'm going to incorporate this into this quilt. And then there's this one, just absolutely gorgeous fabric. And the feel of this is like satiny silk. I mean, it's gorgeous. The first thing I did was grab about 4 of the fat quarters each time. I gave everything a good hot press. And then I lined up all of the salvages together as straight as I could. The reason why I lined up the salvages first is because we know that that was the straightest part when they were actually manufacturing this fabric. You can see here, once you lay it all straight after it's been pressed, things get askewed during that process. You can see it's all different lengths even and widths, and sometimes it kind of veers off. It's just all in the way that they do their cutting. The first thing that I'm going to do is find my shortest point here, which is this fabric right here. And I'm going to trim that edge because this is going to be our cut edge. Make sure that the salvage edge is lined up perfectly on one of the lines on your mat. That will help. Now I forget what Cindy said in the Fabric Patches video on what the widths were of strips that she first cut. So what I'm doing for my quilt is 3.5, 3 inches, 2.5, 2 inches, 1 3/4, and 1.5 inch strips. So my first cut is going to be 3.5, and I take this ruler here, my smaller one, and line up 3.5, and I butt this ruler up right against there, against this ruler, and then I slide this one up and down to make sure that I'm still maintaining a 3.5 inch. Looks good. 3 inches. Again, check to make sure that you're at 3 inches all the way up and down, and then slice. 2.5 inches. 2 inches. 1 3/4 inches. 1.5 inches. After cutting the initial strips, I had about 6 inches left off of each fat quarter. I've cut up approximately 22 fat quarters. Cindy said in her video to alternate sizes and fabric prints. She also said not to fuss too much with this step because in the end it didn't matter. I am going to make sure that the size and print that is next to this is different. I did not pin any of my strips together as they were sewn. I just line up my fabric against my presser foot because I've already measured 1/4 inch over, and so I know I'm getting 1/4 inch every time. So you can see here I've sewn a bunch of strips together and then I've pressed them all one way. Next step is to turn the fabric the opposite way, and then you're going to cut strips the same as you did before in the same sizes, 1.5, 1 3/4, 2, 2.5, 3, and 3.5. What I need to do first is to cut off all of the jagged edges. Line it up best you can with your ruler. So we ended up getting 7 strips. We had the bonus strip of the 3 1/4 inch strip that we ended up getting at the end. So I'm going to pile these up and I'm going to get to cutting because I have a lot more pieces to cut up in order to get to the next step. Let me show you how to work around these little tiny panels. For this particular fat quarter, I only got 1, 2, 3 whole pictures as far as panels go. What I did notice, which was really neat about these particular fat quarters of this print, this is not in the line that I got within the fat quarters. This print, this little purple one, this stripe, this little print, this one, and this one, and this one, and this one with the little daisies. I'm going to utilize that within the quilt because since I don't have that print, that would be really nice to make sure that that print is in there. What I am going to do is make sure that I have the straightest edge. Cindy said in the initial crumb cake video to straighten these because they do come kind of wonky sometimes, and this one is no different because you can see here this is not perfectly square, so I have to really make that square. For this particular piece right here, let me take a look here. I think I'm going to be able to add this, this, and this into the center. Since this is not perfectly straight right there, and I think it would be noticeable, I'm going to try and square that off so that that's straight. These are so stinking cute, I can't take it. I mean, for real. So we're gonna add this to the top. What you're going to do is, Cindy explained it as a log cabin effect. You're going to sew that strip on there, square it off, then you're going to add the next strip, and the next one, and the next one. Flip this like this. Also going to leave a little off the edge here because on the other blocks I made, I did notice I needed just a little bit more to make sure that I can square that off in the end. And then if you know right here, you know, you can cut if you know where that's going to end, which we do. It ends right there. But we'll square all this up once we sew it on. 1/4 inch seam allowance straight down, and I'll meet you back. And then I have been rolling all of my seams outward to one side. So once you get this connected right here, what you're going to do is square off. And how I did that was I knew that this was a straight line, and then I found that seam right here. Any seam really that you can match it up here will work if you've measured it along the way and you know that it's square. Sometimes things can get out of whack though, so you want to make sure that you check that often. So we did that. So we'll put it across the side here and we'll sew that up. Square it up, and you'll continue squaring and adding. Next, it's time to add this piece down here. Cindy also mentioned to add strips too that you had cut from the fat quarters anywhere that you'd like. And honestly, I think that's a great idea. It really does add so much more to this crumb cake quilt. So what you'll do is just flip it up and sew it. You can see here on these prints that I didn't even add those in. They were already in the fat quarter, so that worked out great. And you can't even tell. Now at this point, you would keep adding. You'd put a strip here, and here, and here, and so on, alternating from the skinnier to the wider, the different widths. Now let's see how we're going to prepare our free motion quilting blocks for this quilt, which has got me super excited. Instead of a print in the center, we are going with just a plain white piece of fabric. That is where I'm going to do some extra free motion quilting. Prepare whatever size you want. I went with all different sizes. This one happens to be about 9 1/4 by 9 1/4 square. I went rectangle. I did all different. Grab your fabric, connect it here. Make sure you square up, sew this onto here, square it up, then sew this one on, square it up, and then sew this one on, and continue going all the way around until you see that you like it. So here's this white piece with these all sewn around like so. And you can see here I trimmed it up square. I think that's key if you don't want any crooked seams, you know, too much anyways. These three prints right here, the red, the tan, and the pink, they were not in my original fat quarter bundle. They were in one of those panels. So I cut them out as straight as I could and I connected them together. Just going to add this, then this, and this. One other thing I wanted to note is when you're at the sewing machine and you're sewing this through, do not pull on these at all. These edges are so fragile. They're not backstitched. You can see they've been cut, so they're not stable. So be really careful. Get it sewn up as quick as you can and don't handle it too much. So here you can see I've added this, and this. Looking good. So far, this is what I have. I am absolutely obsessing over this quilt. As a matter of fact, I think that's what the thumbnail is going to be because I am just so excited about this quilt. I know I'm excited about all the quilts that I make, but this one I'm excited about. I say that every time though, don't I? But look at it. It's amazing so far. I better get busy though, because there's a lot more work to do here. I didn't do traditional block sizes like you would normally do in a quilt, and I think this pattern calls for that as well. I just made different size blocks and then I build on them after that. Like right there in between those two blocks, I will add a strip down the center to connect those two, and then I'll just work my way across, making that a real row, but in the length that I need it to be. After I connect those first two blocks there in the top row with the strip, then I take note of how much more I need to add possibly to the bottom of those two blocks that I just connected. And then I look at the rest of the row too. I know I'm going to have to add to the top and bottom of that last block. And so this is the end result of me building that row together. This is absolutely how my brain works in order to piece a quilt together. Now, could I have a standard plan in place, like make each one of these a certain size? I could, but my brain doesn't work like that. I think it's because I immediately feel the creativity with the fabric and what I'm going to do with it, and I just start sewing and putting things together, and then I get sidetracked with another block and start building on it. I'm not sure why I do it that way, but it works for me. Okay, all three rows are done, but it's not big enough. So I'm going to add row 2 and 4. By adding 2 extra rows, I was able to put more white squares or rectangles in, making it much more fun when I go to free motion quilt on this quilt. Remember those extra ends of the fat quarters that I didn't cut initially? Well, those are what I'm going to use now on these extra 2 rows. Now this will give me about 18 inches more in length on this quilt, which is much better. All the rows are done, and here's what it looks like right before I connect everything together. Now I actually had to pin this up on my design wall because it kept falling everywhere. So it looks like those bottom rows are sewn together, but they're not yet. So they're just really close together pinned. I also added a little bit more to those 2 extra rows that I made, so that way I'll be able to square things off and trim it much easier. Next, I took my 505 spray adhesive and basted the quilt top and my batting together on my design wall. I will add my backing after I'm done with all my free motion quilting on the batting and the quilt top, because I like double gauze as my backing, and I like to typically tack it down instead of free motion quilt on it. For one of my free motion quilting white blocks, I took my magnetic pin holder that was in a squarish shape, laid it in one of the white squares, and traced in the center. That made a perfect guide for my feathers in this particular block. And you can see here, I just went around the entire square, just making a lot of feathers, and I left some space along the edge and the tip of the feather because I'm also going to add feathers along that area too, as well as the center of the block. Free motion quilting is one of my favorite things to do. Now, it's not my only favorite thing to do in quilting, but it definitely is up there with one of the top things. that I love to do when it comes to making a quilt. There's just something about when you're all done making your quilt and you see all those just quilty little pillows all in your quilt, and you know that you've been the person to make those little quilty pillows. There's something to be said about that, I think. It's an accomplishment sort of feeling of pride and taking pride in your work. Okay, enough of that. Now on to free motion quilting some roses. This is one of my favorite things to free motion quilt. To make my roses look larger than what they really are when I first start, I do a lot of echoing around the petals, and then I also do add in a lot of leaves as fillers. It gives the illusion that it's a big bouquet of flowers, and I just love the way it turns out. I mean, look at how cute, right? I mean, I love it. This right here is a pea pod that I do. It's just a lot of echoing around a leaf and the little circles in the center. Now this is one of my favorites right here. This is the green olive pattern, and I don't know if I was the first one to come up with that or not, but I'll own it if I did. This quilt is no doubt extremely busy, so I chose to do a simple meander throughout the entire rest of the quilt, and I think that was a good choice because really the show is the patchwork, but it's also the free motion quilting. I mean, it's just everything. With a meander, you can get enough texture without it being totally overbearing. Okay, so for the border, I went a little different than I'd ever done before. I did feathers, but yet I did variations of the feathers. I did little tiny curves with scribbles on the end, just like right there, to make it look like it was coming up out of the side there. And then I would add more feathers, and then I would add a little curly cue like that right there. I mean, it was just really so much fun to make this border with the free motion quilting. But in order to make it easy on myself, I did go in one direction all the way around the entire quilt border. If you've ever watched one of my quilting tutorials, you do know that I trim all of my corners first, and then I go for the sides. And this one was no different. This is exactly how I did this one. And I'm not even sure why I do it this way, but I think it just makes sense to me. I don't know. Do you guys do it that way? Share in the comments. I'd love to know. I just wanted to share with you how much I had left over from those 22 fat quarters that I initially cut up. I do have a few inches left here from the salvage edges, about up to 4 inches or so. And then I do have a pile of scraps where I had sewn some together that I didn't end up using. Not too much left. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to bind this quilt using the scraps from this, which would totally make sense, I know, but I typically don't make any decisions about binding until I get to that point. So we'll see. Here's an example of double gauze on the back of one of my quilts. This is my scrum quilt right here. I've washed this quilt probably 50 times or more so far, and the gauze is holding up absolutely beautiful. This is one of the most cuddliest quilts I've ever had. This is the one I grab for in the evening when I just want to sit on the couch and chill. Like with all the quilts that all of us make, there's always a story behind each one of them, and this one is no different. This is the quilt I saw, obsessed over, conquered it, and I couldn't be more pleased with it. Be sure to check out the Fabric Patches YouTube channel. They have a ton of great content over there. Want to stay on for the ride and learn some more? Click on one of the videos that's on the screen right now, and I will see you in the next tutorial for sure. Until next time on the Sewing Channel, take care.